Hello and welcome. I'm Perrin Desports, one of the founders at Tusk Partners, and I'll be your host for this webinar. This is a two-part webinar series that contains some of the best content taken directly from our DSO fundamentals teaching decks. All of us at Tusk appreciate your time and interest, so let's dive right in. A few quick housekeeping issues before we get started. Hopefully you just received an email from me. In that email, it contains a download link for this entire deck that you're about to see. I recommend that you pause the video now and check your email inbox or your spam filter. Assuming that you got it, click on the link and download the deck. This will allow you to take notes, scribble in the margins, make comments, and anything that you want to follow up on. You can also pause, rewind, fast forward the video anytime that you want to. These webinars are a two-part series, and we've broken them down to try to make it easy in terms of file download sizes, and they should each last about 20 to 30 minutes. You can watch both of them back to back or at separate occasions. This is obviously a video of a webinar series, but I still encourage you to ask questions. You can email us at any point in time, and I'll give you all of our contact information about how to reach us. But feel free to ask anything that we cover in this deck or in the upcoming second webinar series, or anything you would like about the DSO industry in general. We're here as a resource for you, and we hope that you'll reach out to us often. So the two webinars in this series are basically, the first is Dental Industry Trends, the emerging middle market DSO space. It's an overview of what got us to where we are right now. The second webinar is more DSO fundamentals, including private equity, valuation drivers, and what we think is going to be happening in the coming years as it relates to the business and practice of dentistry. I'll start by giving you a quick overview of exactly who we are and what we do so you'll understand a bit more about our background. That's me in the middle. I'm Perrin Desports, and those are my two partners, Diwakar Sinha and Kevin Cumbus. Kevin got his start in investment banking with Wachovia Securities. After business school, he spent 4 years with the McGill-Hill Group here in Charlotte, North Carolina, focused on practice transitions and valuation. After leaving the McGill-Hill Group, he did 4 years with Affordable Care Incorporated in their DSO operations and roll-up strategy. Diwakar is the banker in the group. He spent the last 15 years of his working career lending money to dentists all over the United States. Most recently, he was Vice President of Sales for East West Bank out of Pasadena. East West was the preeminent lender in the emerging market DSO space of dentistry. And I've got 15 years of distribution experience, having run 3 different operations for Patterson Dental Company. There are 2 facets of our business here at Tusk. The first is an online brokerage website. Think Zillow.com meets dental practice brokerage. Until now, if you want to sell your dental practice, you basically had 2 options. You can pay a broker 10% to sell your practice, or you can go it alone and do it in a for sale by owner model, neither of which are a really good value proposition. We leverage modern technology to reduce our costs and pass those savings on to our sellers, and we charge 5% commission to do that. You'll see that our listings feature beautiful professional photographs, informative graphical displays of clinical, financial, and operational successes, and much, much more. We think more engaged buyers hopefully means more offers and potentially a higher selling price for our sellers. It's a wonderful value proposition. You can see more examples of our listings and get further details at tuskbrokerage.com. The second facet of our business, and really what we're going to dive into more tonight, is on the Tusk Partners side of the business. This is focused more squarely on group practices and DSOs, especially those in the emerging market. Think 5 to 25 locations. Your legal structure is critically important, and you need to define it early on in your DSO because it impacts equity and exit considerations as you scale your business. Debt structure is something that not too many emerging market DSOs consider until it's too late. Traditional lenders typically pull back around 4 locations and roughly $2 million in debt exposure. So we help them find alternative sources of capital. You can learn more from our white paper on our website called Debt Financing in the Emerging DSO. We offer buy-side advisory services and sell-side advisory services. Most DSOs will grow through acquisitions, so they frequently come to us and ask them to find targets to acquire. Then we do some quantitative modeling to determine the upside of the acquisition as it fits within their DSO. On the sell-side advisory, this is really more of a go-to-market strategy. It's about a 3 to 6 month process where we prepare the business for sale operationally and financially, trying to show it in its best light. And then we take it to market to find the best partner or acquirer, be it private equity or an enterprise level DSO. To go from small to medium to large takes a little bit of hand-holding, and our strategic consulting offering is geared toward that end. Our engagements typically last about 6 to 36 months, and they're designed to help a DSO grow and scale their business to the point of preparing for sale. You can find more information about these services as well at tusk-partners.com. So now that you know a bit more about who we are and what we do, let's dive into what's brought us to this point in our collective industry. Most of us have experienced much on this slide, whether we know the numbers or not. Compounded annual growth rates of about 6% is more than 2 times the projected GDP growth for the coming years. The word recession in dentistry typically means no growth or it being flat, whereas in most sectors of the overall economy, that's a double-digit rate of decline. The dental industry has been insulated from a lot of this for a number of years, but we think some of the best days for the businesses are ahead of us. This is a slide that breaks down much of where that segmentation is and the key insights into it. And again, the compounded annual growth rate, or CAGR, is forecasted to be about twice the overall economy average in the coming years. This is one of the factors that makes the industry so attractive to people who aren't in it presently, be it money lenders or others. There are many different factors that influence that 6% compounded annual growth rate that we mentioned in the prior slide. 6 of the most notable are consolidation in the space led by DSOs, private equity investment in our sector, the increasing cost and complexity around compliance, realization in terms of the number of locations, especially in emerging suburbs, the enrollment of women in dentistry overall, and the fact that they now make up more than half of dental school enrollment, and certainly the high debt of graduates, with most undergrads coming out with over $300,000 in debt before they even get into the private practice world. This next slide gives a really interesting look at the top 15 DSOs in the dental industry space as of a couple of years ago. I'll have you notice that and try to highlight for you. This comes from 2011 to the period ending in 2014. Most of you recognize the names on the left-hand side, but if you look at the change column on the far right side, you'll notice that a lot of these DSOs basically doubled in size in a matter of only 3 years. That's not unusual because at the time the slide was developed, almost all of these, with the exception of Pacific Dental Services, were private equity backed. We're going to talk a lot about private equity in a subsequent webinar, but one rule of thumb to remember is that private equity investors typically want to triple their returns in a matter of 5 years. So if you see these businesses doubling in a matter of 3 years, that's not an unforeseen set of circumstances, and it's not, frankly, an unusual pace for them to develop so many additional locations. Well, what do things look like in the coming years? Industry analysts and a lot of research companies point to the emerging middle market as being the real area of growth. Emerging middle market being this segment right here. As of 2016, it only makes up about 13% of the market. We're talking roughly the 5 to 25 location space. Your elite groups are your Heartland Dentals, Aspen Dentals, Pacific Dentals of the world, and then your private practice solo locations making up 3/4 of the market. The real drive in the coming years, though, is to see the emerging market ending up at about 25% total market share with the fastest compounded annual growth rate of any listed on the slide. This is a very interesting industry dynamic. However, we're going to come back to it and revisit it on the subsequent webinar because I think there's a story behind the story that's incredibly important to tell, and it relates to what are the practices that find themselves in the mid-market space in DSO. As we dig deeper into the DSO space, let's define a quick important term called EBITDA. EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And it's an easy way to normalize profitability between similar businesses. If you run a dental practice and I run a dental practice, we may practice in different states, but which practice is more valuable? Well, if you pay a different tax rate than I do, and I have some loans outstanding for some equipment that I have purchased, all of that factors into the true profitability of the practice, and it looks different in a profit and loss statement than if you normalize it. EBITDA is a way to get to those earnings by taking out all those superfluous expenses. You don't need to know how to calculate EBITDA, and we're not going to test you on it, but you do need to know that it's the basis for how DSOs are bought and sold. And if somebody's talking about multiples, that probably means they're talking about multiples of EBITDA. So why are DSOs all of a sudden so popular, and why does everybody seemingly want to form one? They're worth millions, right? Sometimes they are, sometimes not. We'll take a look. This slide shows some recent activity in the M&A space. And it's incredibly important to take a look at a couple of different deals. But before I do that, I want to draw your attention to one aspect on the right-hand side, which is this EBITDA column. You'll notice if you start at the bottom with Northeast Dental Management down here, they sold for about 8 times EBITDA in April of 2012. Their EBITDA was $10.6 million, and they sold for an enterprise value of $90 million, a multiple of about 8.5 times. If you go up the right-hand column, you'll notice that the EBITDA multiples pretty much consistently increase over time, from older trades to more recent ones. 2 trades in particular, the Gentle Dental trade and the Decadental trade, are significant to look at. In October of 2012, when Gentle Dental was sold, they had an EBITDA of $8.2 million. They sold for about an enterprise value of $80 million, which is a 9.8 multiple. Only about 3 years later, Decadental sold at a multiple almost twice what Gentle Dental was. That's a staggering thing to contemplate. I wonder what drove it. Well, let's dig in and see if we can work an example. Sometimes the easiest way to illustrate DSO valuation is through simple math. So let's take a look at a typical $1 million practice. We allocate that $1 million 70-30, clinical to hygiene. There's a 60% overhead rate, and we make adjustments for clinical compensation. That's to normalize income, like I mentioned before, leaving an entrepreneurial profit of about $190,000. Now, if you went to a broker and said you wanted to sell this $1 million practice to a solo buyer, you'd probably get about 80% of revenue for it, or $800,000. That's an EBITDA multiple of about 4.2 times. Pretty realistic, pretty normal, nothing really unusual about that. Well, let's take a look what it might look like if you had 7 practices. These are all roughly set up the same way. They vary a little bit in collections on the top line. They're still split 70-30, clinical to hygiene. We still pay a 60% overhead rate, and we're paying our doctors 30% of clinical collections. You can see at the bottom the entrepreneurial profit here. They're all valued the same way, same revenue multiple, and same EBITDA multiple. If you sold them all individually, one by one by one, that would add up to about $5.5 million of proceeds from the sale of the 7 practices. Not bad. Pretty good payday for seven independent practice sales. But what happens if we look at them collectively? Instead of looking at them as 7 independent practices, let's look at them as one business entity. What can we learn from that? Well, typically when you form a DSO, you're able to drive some additional revenue on the top line. You can negotiate your rates with insurance companies for better reimbursement. You're probably going to have a little bit more marketing capital to deploy, drive new patients and such. It's reasonable to assume that you're going to get a slight increase in terms of additional revenue on the top line. Still split between 70% of clinical and 30% hygiene production, just like before, but we're also able to take out some of our overhead. This can be found through negotiating supply costs or your lab costs, possibly consolidating some services like a call center or an accounts receivable and insurance processing group instead of concentrating those resources at a practice level. So it's reasonable to assume that we can take some overhead out of the business by forming a bigger group entity. Having said that, you've got to add some more cost into it at a corporate level, and that's what the DSO expenses are. You probably need a CEO to run it. We'll pay him $200,000, and you've got maybe 2 or 3 other staff members making between $50,000 and $75,000 a year, so we'll pay them as well. So our entire DSO overhead to run the business is about $350,000. And when you subtract that from the practice EBITDA, you're left with a net EBITDA number of a little bit over $1.9 million. Value creation is ultimately seen when you want to sell the practice, or in this case, sell the group practice, sell the business. We said before that if you sold all 7 of those independent practices to solo buyers, you'd probably realize about $5.5 million of proceeds from the sale of them. But when you look at this group practice in terms of one business entity and you take it to market, you're probably going to be selling it to a private equity company. Private equity company or a larger enterprise level DSO would probably pay between 4 and 8 times EBITDA for the business. We've gone right down the middle and said let's value it at 6 times EBITDA. So a multiple of 6 times the net EBITDA of 1.9 million results in an enterprise value of a little bit over almost $11.5 million. Now we said just a few seconds ago that if you sold those 7 practices independently, they'd fetch a collective $5.5 million. If you sell this thing as a business, it'll make more than twice that much. an ROI of over 200, almost 210%. Honestly, this 6 times multiple is completely in line with what we see in the marketplace nowadays. It's not outrageous, it's relatively normal, and it's frankly to be expected for a good performing business. This is not unusual. This is how value is created in a DSO. And in short, this is why everybody's really interested in forming one. But if this is what somebody's willing to pay for, in this case, this particular DSO, are they crazy or do they know something that we don't? How are they going to get their money out of it? Well, let's take a look at that. So private equity bought your DSO for 6 times, like we just showed. We call what you just sold a platform. A platform is a group practice that has consolidated services that are scalable for future growth. And by that, I mean you end up pulling services in-house, like a call center, like an insurance processing or accounts receivable center, like a marketing team. All of these centralization of services can support other additional new dental practices. Those bolt-on acquisitions help to grow the overall business. So the way this works is private equity, as an example, buys your platform for 6 times EBITDA. They just paid you almost $11.5 million for your business. The next thing they're going to do is try to grow it. And they're probably going to grow it, in this case, through acquisitions. So let's say, to keep this really simple, that they go out and buy those other 7 practices like we illustrated before. And they pay 4.2 times EBITDA, just the way we illustrated. They're going to pay a total of a little bit over $8 million to acquire those 7 practices. After they're done buying your platform and buying those other practices to bolt onto the platform, they're going to focus on running the business. They're going to probably get some more efficiencies and economies of scale, but we're not even taking that into consideration. All we're saying is they're going to grow the EBITDA of the business 5% every year for 5 years. And they're going to go from an EBITDA today of $3.8 million to an EBITDA 5 years from now of almost $4.9 million. And then they're going to sell it. And when they sell a business that has almost $5 million worth of EBITDA, that will fetch a higher multiple than what your original sale was. That multiple that they're able to realize is probably somewhere between 8 times EBITDA and 12 times EBITDA. So let's use 10, which is straight down the middle. 10 times your EBITDA now of almost $4.9 million is, you guessed it, close to $49 million of enterprise value. They bought yours for 11. They bolted on 7 others for 8, meaning they've spent almost $20 million to acquire all those practices, and they just sold it for $49 million. An ROI of 250%. Several slides ago, I said that it wasn't unusual to see a lot of the enterprise level DSOs basically doubling their business in a matter of 3 years. Private equity's objectives, again, are roughly to triple their investment over a horizon of about 5 years. This ROI that we're showing of 250% on this slide, again, is nothing unreasonable. It's not unusual. and it's really maybe even a little bit light. Scary to think, isn't it? So hopefully this gives you a little bit better understanding of how the dental industry has arrived in the place where it currently sits. We're in an interesting time right now in the business and practice of dentistry. The industry that we've all known and loved, regardless of whether you actually practice clinical dentistry or you support it by being an industry professional, is changing rapidly. We think the pace of change has been rapid up to this point. I shudder to think what it's going to be like in the coming years, but I think it's going to be more tumultuous and frankly a lot faster. There are internal and external influences driving all that change, but ultimately all of those changes are born out of abundance and opportunities for growth. And I got to be honest with you, at some point we all need to begin to view these changes for the tremendous benefits that they bring, not threats, but benefits. We're living through a period that other slow growth and static industries would frankly love to experience. It is chaotic. It's not the same sleepy industry that we've always been a part of. It's a little bit rocky and bumpy, but it's very prosperous for so many of us. And I hope we won't lose track of that. So as we come to a conclusion on this initial webinar, how can you stay connected with us? In the deck that you downloaded, and if you keep it in PDF format, you can actually access some of the links on it. If you want to refer a friend or a colleague who might benefit from this webinar, let us know and we'll send them the link. If you want to continue to grow your knowledge of the DSO space, our blog is a great wealth of information and you can subscribe right there. And if you're looking for an industry expert to provide DSO-related content, we speak at seminars, trade shows, customer events, study clubs all the time. We can provide content for a remote-hosted webinar or a series of them. We can co-author content for a blog, trade publication, white paper, ebook, or otherwise. You can download our speaker and PR packet off your PDF as well. And if you have questions about any material we presented in this webinar or others and want to drop us a line or give us a call, our direct contact information's on the next page. You can send an email to me, DeWalker, or Kevin directly, or feel free to call any of us. The next webinar in the series is going to be DSO fundamentals, beyond what we've covered here. We'll deal more with private equity, we'll talk about valuation drivers, and we'll give a little bit of a look at what the coming years might look like for our industry. We hope you'll join us for our second webinar, and thanks for your attention on this one. We've appreciated having you with us.